Chapter 1, The New Mound. I sat in the darkness of the living room. Only the moonlight, thin as a knife blade, cut through the old curtains. The pendulum clock in the hallway. Tick, tock. It always echoed in this house, but tonight, it felt like a countdown to something even I didn't yet understand. I was waiting. Waiting for the distinct squeak of the third floorboard on the stairs. Thomas's sound. He always walked heavily, as if intent on crushing everything beneath his feet. Waiting for the sound of their bedroom door closing, a dry, definite thud. And then, waiting for 10 minutes of silence. Elara always needed 10 minutes before turning off the light. I had learned their rhythms. I had learned how to live around them, in the very house that used to be mine. My breath formed a small mist in the cold air of the room. Tonight, the silence was not empty. It was heavy. It was listening, just as I was. It knew I was about to do something. They said Buddy had run off. Thomas said it at breakfast, without lifting his face from the newspaper. That old dog, he probably went off to find a place to die, he mumbled, turning the page. The rustle of the paper sounded shrill in the morning silence. Elara simply poured more coffee into his cup, her hand perfectly steady. A stream of thick, black coffee. She was that kind of person. Efficient. Neat. She disliked mess. She disliked dog hair on the furniture, she disliked joyful barking at dawn. She disliked love without reason, the kind of love that yielded no profit. Since she moved in, the house had lost its color. Everything became organized. And cold. Buddy was the last thing left of my mother. She brought him home one cold January night, a tiny, shivering ball of fluff in the blizzard. He needs us, and we need him, she said, wrapping him in an old tablecloth. She was right. Now she was gone. And so was Buddy. But Buddy wouldn't run off. Not my Buddy. He was 14 years old. His hips were stiff with the cold. He moved slowly, but his eyes were still bright. He wouldn't abandon me. He would never leave the porch on his own. Yesterday, when I went to town for feed, he was still lying on his old rug by the fireplace. When I returned, the rug was gone. His water bowl, too. I did a little cleaning, Elara said, wiping her hands on her apron. Less clutter. I didn't say anything. I just walked outside and looked toward the oak tree. And I saw it. Even from a distance, I could see the patch of disturbed earth. Tick, tock. The sound I was waiting for finally came. The faint but unmistakable squeak of the third floorboard. Thomas's heavy footsteps. The door closing. Thud. I started counting. Every second. 1. 2. 3. I counted my own breath. Inhale, hold, exhale. 10 minutes dragged by like an hour. When the silence had settled completely, when the house had sunk into its heavy, feigned sleep, I slowly rose. My knee joints cracked. I didn't turn on a light. I knew this house by heart. I knew where the floorboards squeaked, and where they were silent. Tonight, I needed them silent. Beside the back door, on the old brass hook, was my mother's sweater. The cream-colored wool she always wore when gardening. It still carried her scent, or perhaps I only imagined it. The smell of dried lavender and dust. I slipped my arms into it. The sleeves were too short for me, reaching only mid-forearm. But the warmth was familiar. It was like a fragile embrace, a promise of protection. The storm lantern sat on the back porch, already filled with oil. I had done it this afternoon, while Elara was hanging laundry. She had watched me from across the yard. Her eyes never left me, like a hawk. She knew I was planning something, but she didn't know what. She only knew I was no longer the docile girl who accepted everything. She didn't speak. And neither did I. I unlatched the back door. A small, sharp metallic click echoed in the still air. I held my breath. Waiting. No sound from upstairs. Only the clock ticking. I gently pulled the door open. The November air. It wasn't just cold. It bit. It slipped through the thin wool, finding my skin, making me shiver. The ground beneath my feet was hard as rock. The withered grass crunched beneath my boots, each step a small shattering sound. The sky was cloudless, full of cold, indifferent stars. The moon cast my shadow long and distorted across the frost-covered lawn. I crouched, shielding the storm lantern. I lit the match. The flame flared up, struggled for a moment before settling into a weak, yellow circle of light. It wasn't bright enough to be seen from the upstairs bedroom windows. I had thought of that. The light was just enough to illuminate the path. The path Buddy and I had walked 1,000 times. The oak tree stood atop the small rise. It was the oldest thing on this land. Its branches reached out like bony, black arms against the night sky. In the moonlight, it looked like a sentry. Or a ghost. Buddy always liked to sleep under this tree, where he could watch both the house and the road. He said he was guarding. And there it was. The lantern light fell upon it. A dark patch of disturbed soil, a scar on the frosted lawn. It wasn't large. But it was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. I approached slowly. My steps faltered. The earth was tossed up carelessly. Large clods of soil were still intact, thrown aside as if the digger was in a hurry. Thomas. This was Thomas's work. He was always rushed with things he despised. There was no care. This was not a resting place. This was a hiding place. They didn't even mark it. Not a single stone. Not a cross made of sticks. Just disturbed earth. As if it were trash. As if 14 years of loyalty meant nothing. A tremor ran down my spine, and it wasn't the cold. The anger. A cold, sharp anger, like a shard of glass breaking in my gut. I set the storm lantern down. Its light cast strange, dancing shadows on the trunk. I knelt. The cold from the frozen ground immediately seeped through the knees of my jeans. It was a sharp, stinging pain, but I ignored it. I stared at the mound of dirt. Did they think I wouldn't know? Or did they think I wouldn't care? Did they think I would just cry and forget? I didn't bring a shovel. I didn't want to make noise. I started using my hands. My bare hands. The earth was hard and cold. The clay was sticky and heavy. Small stones cut into my palms, tearing the skin. I didn't care. I scraped. The soil crumbled beneath my fingernails, filling them with black, cold dirt. I didn't think. I just dug. I had to see him. I had to know. Tears started to fall, not from sadness, but from rage. They were hot on my cheeks and quickly turned cold in the air. I was expecting that feeling. His rough, yet soft fur. I was braced for it. I was ready to say my own goodbye. But my fingers didn't touch fur. They touched something hard. Cold. And smooth. I stopped. My breath came in ragged gasps, forming white clouds in front of me. I scraped away more dirt. No. It wasn't bone. It was too even. Too square. In the flickering light of the storm lantern, I saw it. A corner of metal. Rusted. Cold metal. It wasn't part of Buddy. It was beneath where Buddy should have been. No. I realized. They didn't just bury Buddy. They buried this thing. And they used Buddy to cover it. They used my love, my grief, to serve as a lid for their secret. The cold anger from before vanished, replaced by something even colder. A strange stillness. I looked back at the house. The lights were still off. They were sleeping. They were sleeping, thinking it was over. But they buried the wrong thing. They thought they buried a dog. They didn't know. They didn't know that what they had just buried was a seed. And I was standing here, in the cold, with dirt beneath my nails, and I was about to start watering it. Chapter 2, The Tin Box. Dirt. That was all I thought of. My breath plumed into white smoke in the lantern light, and all I could smell was damp, freezing earth. My hands were past feeling. They were just tools, numb and clumsy, scraping against the hard crust of the ground. Small, sharp stones dug into my skin, but I felt no pain. The only ache was the silence from the house behind me. I had expected to feel it. Buddy's thick, familiar fur. I was braced for that awful softness. But my fingers, raw and cracked, struck something else. A sharp clink. It wasn't the dull thud of earth. It was a sharp, dead sound. A sound that did not belong here. Cold metal. My breath caught in my throat. The wind seemed to stop, too. For a moment, the world was only the pounding in my ears, and the cold of the metal transferring through my fingertips. I scraped harder. Frantically. The frozen soil clung to it, but I used my nails as claws, breaking the icy clumps of clay away from its edges. It wasn't deep. God, it wasn't deep at all. I realized the truth, like a shard of glass in my gut. Whatever this was, they had simply placed Buddy right on top of it. They had used my dog, as a blanket. As a thin layer of camouflage. They hadn't dug a grave. They were only covering up something. And they thought my grief would blind me. They thought I would just cry in my room, looking out the window, and never come near. They had underestimated my sorrow. They had mistaken it for weakness. Anger, cold and silent, made my hands work again. I was no longer digging like someone searching for something lost. I was digging like someone unearthing a crime. I pushed the dirt aside, oblivious to the noise. The numbness was gone, replaced by a searing focus. And then, in the weak, flickering light of the storm lantern, I saw it. It was wrapped in something. An old piece of oilcloth, the kind my father used to cover the tractor engine. It was stiff with age and cold, cracked at the folds. The fabric was dark green, almost black, and clung to the object underneath. I used my thumb to pry a corner of the cloth. It tore away like old paper, revealing the thing underneath. A box. A small, tin box. My heart didn't just beat. It lurched. A painful, sudden slam against my ribs. I knew this box. Even in the poor light, even with the red paint almost entirely gone, even with the angry, orange rust eating through the edges. I knew it. It was my father's tobacco tin. The one he always kept on his workbench, filled with screws and washers. The one that disappeared the same winter he became silent. I pulled it free from the hole. It came with a sickening schluck of suction, heavier than I expected. Dirt and ice broke away as I lifted it. I held it in my palm. The cold of it was bone deep. And that is when I understood. A truth colder than the metal, clearer than the stars overhead. Buddy didn't die here. He wasn't sick. He hadn't gone off to die, as Thomas had said, with such casual indifference, turning the page of his newspaper this morning. My dog was a digger. He always was. He chased gophers, he buried bones. He knew this patch of ground under the oak tree better than anyone. He found this. He dug it up. He probably brought it to the house, tail wagging, so proud of his wet, muddy treasure, just like he always did. He would have dropped this at Elara's feet or Thomas's. And they saw him. They saw him with this box. A cold, sick feeling washed over me, colder than the wind. But he didn't die here. He was killed. He was killed because he found this. Because he unearthed a secret they wanted kept buried. And the hole, the shallow, hurried hole, it wasn't a grave for a beloved dog. It was simply disposal. They put him on top of the secret he'd found, and covered them both. 2 problems, solved with 1 shovel. The air left my lungs. This was not grief anymore. This was fire. A cold fire, starting in my stomach. My hands were shaking. Not from cold. But from quiet, deep rage. I looked back at the house. The windows were still dark. Black eyes, watching nothing. I couldn't go back in there. Not yet. Not with this. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I unbuttoned the top of my mother's sweater and shoved the tin box inside. It was icy cold against my skin. It felt like a block of ice, lying right over my heart. My heart hammered against it. A trapped bird, beating its wings against a metal cage. I picked up the lantern. I didn't bother to fill the hole. Let them see it. Let them wonder. I turned, not toward the house, but toward the barn. The barn was my father's place. It was the only place left on this farm that didn't feel like theirs. My boots crunched on the frozen grass. Every step was loud in the silence. I slid the heavy barn door open, just enough to slip inside. The smell of old hay, and dust, and metal, it was the smell of safety. I sat down on an old bale of straw, the cold metal box pressed against my chest, and in the dark, I finally let myself breathe. Chapter 3, Mother's Words. Script start. I sat on an old bale of straw, hard and smelling of sweet earth. The barn was where I could breathe. The yellow light of the storm lantern stained the space, not enough to banish the darkness, but enough to see. The cold tin box was still in my hands. I had to open it. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was anticipation. I placed it on my father's old workbench. The surface was still slick with grease, where he used to mend everything, from the lawnmower to broken hearts. I looked at the small latch, corroded by rust, holding the secret inside. I needed a tool. A screwdriver? No. Too noisy. I looked around. The old, heavy vice grips were there. They were covered in dust, but the feel of them was familiar. I placed the jaw of the grips onto the latch. My hands trembled slightly, and I had to tell myself to be still. I squeezed hard. Keat. A small, high, pained moan escaped from the old metal. The sound felt loud in the silent expanse of the barn. I paused. Listened. Only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the roof. I pressed again, harder. This time, I put all my weight into it. The latch clicked with a cack, followed by a small, dry whoosh, like stale air being expelled. I slowly lifted the lid. The smell. A powerful scent of mildew, earth, and old tobacco rushed up into my nostrils. It reminded me of my father instantly. His smell, the scent of years past, the scent of forgotten things. My nose stung. Tears welled up again, but I blinked, forcing them to retreat. I had to look. Inside, it was not what Thomas and Elara had hoped for. It was not money. Inside was a stack of papers, tied neatly with a faded blue silk ribbon, almost white now. The ribbon was so frail it looked as if it would disintegrate if I touched it. I gently lifted them out. The box was empty, save for a layer of orange rust dust. I placed the bundle of letters on the bench. The ribbon slipped from my fingers. I picked up the top letter. The paper was cream-colored, thin and brittle. The folds were about to tear. The lantern light made the black ink look like an old wound on the page. I brought it closer. I knew that script. Sharp, slanted, full yet graceful handwriting. My mother's handwriting. My darling girl. I couldn't read the first greeting. I had to look away. I had to inhale deeply. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in years. And now, it was staring back at me, cold and alive on this page. The years had blurred my memories. Thomas had made me doubt my own mind, making me think Mother was a weak, forgetful woman who had worried my father. But this script, it was strong. It was the truth. I forced myself to focus on the first working line. Thomas did it again. He took $2,000 from the corn money. He said it was taxes, but his eyes lie. I flipped through the letters. They were not tender words of affection. They were notes. Facts. She had written them like a diary, but a diary meant for me. Dates. Amounts. The lies Thomas had told. She wrote about how Thomas had gradually taken control of everything. He prevented her from going to the bank, he changed the suppliers, he was always right. They think I am stupid, she wrote in a letter dated last August. I pretend to be. I have to. If he knows I know, he will move faster. My mother's pain, it was almost physical. I could see her sitting at the kitchen table, writing in the evenings, hiding the notes beneath a cabinet. She was afraid of her son. Her own son. My tears, this time, were for my mother. For the years of silent isolation she had endured. I reached the final letter. It was written hastily. The handwriting was shakier. They found out. They know I talked to the lawyer. I don't have time, my darling girl. Listen. The real deed to the farm, the one your father left you, is not in the safe. Thomas took the safe's contents. But the original, the legal one. I took it out. The letter stopped abruptly, alarmingly. As if it had been cut short. The ink was smeared in one corner. I searched the box. There was one other, smaller piece of paper, folded in half. I opened it. My mother's script, more trembling than ever. The original, with your father's true signature. I hid it in the only place he would never think to look. By the old hog pen, under the loose floorboard. Your dog will lead you there. He knows the spot. I trained him. Trust Buddy. A chill shot down my spine. Buddy. He was guarding it. He dug it up. And that is why he died. Not because he found the tin box, but because the tin box lay on the path to the secret. Or perhaps the box was simply a clue for him. Thomas saw Buddy digging, and he acted. I folded the paper. The coldness inside me had turned to ice. There was no more sadness. Only intense focus. I placed the letters back into the tin box. I didn't need to read any more. I had enough. I stared at the rusted box. It was no longer a keepsake. It was evidence. It was the truth. I tied the faded blue ribbon around the stack of letters once more. Fragile, yet unbreakable. I closed the lid. A small, definitive clack. I understood my mother's silence now. It wasn't acceptance. It was strategy. I stood up. The cold of the barn was still there, but it no longer felt daunting. It was my ally. I tucked the tin box deep inside my mother's sweater. It was still icy, but now, it was a weight. A promise. Thomas. Elara. You made a mistake. You buried the wrong thing. You buried my dog, thinking you were burying a secret. But you dug up someone else. I will not wait. I will not be silent. I have a dog to avenge, and a mother to prove right. Now I must go to the old hog pen. Chapter 4, The Silent Breakfast. I didn't sleep. I had spent the rest of the night on the stool in the barn. The tin box was cold against me, and my mother's letters, neatly folded in a small pouch, were pressed against my chest. Dawn arrived with a thin layer of mist. There was no snow, but the cold was still sharp as a knife. I washed the dirt from my hands, but I did not change my clothes. I still wore my mother's old sweater. I knew Thomas and Elara were already in the kitchen. They were always early risers, not out of diligence, but out of a need to control. A need to set their rhythm before I woke. I walked through the back door. The house was still cold. The smell of coffee and toast lingered. This was where the fight began. Not with shouting or tears, but with silence and truth. I entered the kitchen. Everything was frighteningly familiar. The old oak table, pristine and spotless. Thomas sat at the head, behind his newspaper, revealing only his salt and pepper hair and his ears. Elara sat opposite, stirring her coffee. The metal spoon clinked against the porcelain cup. Clink. 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 A perfect rhythm. A perfectly constructed normalcy. No one said, "Good morning." They never did. They were trying. They were trying to make everything normal. Thomas had even placed a small vase of fake, yellowing flowers in the center of the table, as if to obscure the emptiness. I stood in the doorway. I did not move. I could feel the icy tin box through the fabric of the pouch. I felt it, and I felt my mother's words. Pretend you don't know. I had done that for years. But not today. Thomas did not look at me, but he knew I was there. I saw his shoulders tense, just slightly. He was waiting. Elara continued to stir. Clink. 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 She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the small, brown vortex in her cup. She was focused on the normal. I began to walk. Slowly. Deliberately. The oak floorboards beneath my feet gave off their familiar creak, but this time, it sounded like a gunshot in a church. I let it be loud. I walked up to the table. I stood at the end, across from Thomas. I said nothing. I looked down at the small, phony vase of flowers. I slowly pulled the rusty tin box from the pouch. I did not let go of it immediately. I held it, my fingers gripping the rough rust. Thomas was so tense he had not moved. He still held the newspaper up. Elara, however, her hand was stirring. Clink. 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 Then it stopped. I set the tin box down. Clack. The sound of metal hitting the polished oak. It rang out, sharp and brutal, shattering the perfect rhythm of the morning. It was an obscenity. A piece of filth. Elara flinched. The metal spoon slipped from her fingers. It fell. Clang. The sound was too loud. It rolled across the table, falling onto the wood floor. She looked at me. For the first time in months, she looked straight into my eyes. Her face was pale, but not from anger. It was from confusion. She didn't know what the object was, but she knew it was the cause. Thomas still had not moved. He was still behind the newspaper, as if it were a shield. I said nothing. I just stood there, watching him, and watching the tin box lying between us. Finally, very slowly, the newspaper began to lower. It was so slow I could count every fold. For the first time in years, he was not a wall of paper. He was Thomas. My brother. His eyes fell straight onto the box. They were cold, always cold, but this time, there was something else there. Not fury. But a horrified recognition. He recognized his father's tobacco tin. He recognized where he had buried it. He recognized the secret he had tried to protect. He swallowed. The sound of his gulp was dry in the silence. Thomas looked at me. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for a sign of madness, of deceit. I returned his gaze. There was no madness. Only an absolute calm. I opened my mouth. I did not speak loudly. I did not need to. My voice was only a whisper, but it carried the weight of every secret, every betrayal, and every grief in this house. Buddy found this. The silence after that statement was horrific. It was not the silence of the morning. It was the silence of a massive break. Thomas took a deep breath, but he could not regain control. I said nothing more. I did not need to. I only looked at the box. The rusty, dirty box, which had shattered their false cleanliness. I knew he was calculating. He was thinking of the letters. He was thinking of the deed. He was thinking of how I knew. But I had one. I had one that moment. I turned from the table, walking toward the fireplace mantel. I placed my hand on the old oak wood. The floorboards beneath my feet did not creak anymore. They were silent. They knew. I never looked back at them. I just waited. I waited for Thomas's next move. Because now, this kitchen was no longer a place for breakfast. It was a courtroom. Chapter 5, The Oak Tree. Thomas did not shout. Elara did not weep. The truth is, they said nothing at all. After my statement, Thomas simply stared at the rusty tin box. Then he looked at Elara. Elara kept her head bowed toward the floor, where her spoon lay. They did not need to deny it. My mother had done all the work for me. The evidence was there, not in the box, but in the silence between us. A silence so thick you could taste it. I had won that moment. I left the kitchen. I did not need to wait for an answer. Their silence was the confession. The lawyer arrived the following afternoon. He was a small, bespectacled man, mildly irritated at having to drive so far out of town. I gave him the tin box and the letters, including the hastily written note about the deed. The deed was found, exactly as my mother had said, beneath a loose floorboard near the old hog pen. The papers were clear. The farm belonged to me, by my father's final will. Thomas and Elara sat at the far end of the dining table throughout the discussion. They said nothing to the lawyer. They just looked at me. A hollow, cold stare, devoid of anger, only quiet despair. They knew they had lost. They had lost to a dead woman and a dead dog. The following week was a silent ordeal. The thudding of cardboard boxes. The heavy footsteps going up and down the stairs. The sound of furniture being dragged across the oak floor. They were clearing out. They were moving out. There were no farewells, no accusations, no loud scenes. Just a silent, shamefaced retreat. Elara packed her things carefully, but I saw the frantic haste in the way she folded her linens. Thomas moved his boxes slowly, as if each one was a last-ditch effort to keep the place. At the end of November, I stood at the living room window. I didn't turn on the lights. I watched their small blue truck rumble away down the dirt track, loaded with all that was theirs. Elara's false cleanliness. Thomas's suppressed rage. Thomas did not look back. Neither did Elara. They were gone. And then, the silence. A different kind of silence. It was not the menacing silence of fear, of something lurking and suppressed. It was the silence of relief. The silence of a house that had finally taken its own breath. When the truck was out of sight, I went to the barn. I retrieved my father's gardening shovel, the one with the worn wooden handle. The shovel Thomas had used to dig that shoddy hole. I returned to the oak tree. I dug. This time, I dug deep. One scoop at a time. The earth was frozen, but it didn't matter. I wanted it right. I wanted it to be a resting place. I dug a clean hole, twice as deep as the last one. I was not hurried. I worked under the weak afternoon sun. Then, I went back to the house. I retrieved Buddy's old blanket. The frayed, worn navy blue wool. It still held his scent, the smell of dog, earth, and the hearth. I placed it into the deep hole, lining it to make a soft bed. I knelt down, and with the care Thomas had denied him, I placed him inside. I stroked his rough fur one last time. There were no tears left. Only love. A goodbye properly spoken. Before filling the hole, I returned to the barn. I took the rusty tin box. I had already taken my mother's letters out, securing them in my father's small safe. The box was empty now. It was a shell. It was evidence that had fulfilled its duty. I placed the empty box beside Buddy, in the corner of the blanket. The secret had been solved. The aggressor had been punished. But the box had to stay, as a reminder of how it all began and how my mother had protected me. Then, I began to fill the hole. One scoop at a time. The earth fell onto the blanket with a soft, steady thud-thud. It sounded like rain falling. It sounded like final peace. I filled the earth until the hole disappeared. I carefully mounded a small pile of dirt. I placed a flat, white stone on top, one I knew Buddy liked to lie on when he was guarding. Everything was in its right place. Everything was finally resolved in the right way. The next morning, I woke early. I went to the kitchen. There was no rustle of Thomas's paper. No clink-clink of Elara's spoon. I made coffee for myself. I was not hurried. I filled my mother's old porcelain mug. I stood by the kitchen window. The December sun was weak. I looked out. I saw the oak tree. I saw the white stone. I took a sip of my coffee. It was hot, and it tasted good. This farm is mine. The silence is no longer cold. It is peaceful. It is an empty space filled with truth. I no longer needed my mother's sweater to feel warm. The warmth now came from within. It is like the house. The house is no longer listening. It is sleeping. For the first time in years, it is finally at rest.